Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer. Robert Buccellato will be back next week when we talk about the final naval battle of the American Revolution, which took place off the coast of Florida, basically off the coast of what is now Brevard County. But today I wanted to fill in a gap here in our narrative and talk a little bit about the capture of the Bahamas, which took place in April of 1783, which is actually just a month after that last naval battle. So we're going a little bit out of order, but the liberation of the Bahamas, or the capture of the Bahamas, however you want to phrase it, has been referenced pretty heavily in our narrative to this point. So I want to fill in the blanks about this. We've gone out of order during the Revolution anyway. We kind of focused on subsets and specific geographic areas. So the Bahamas had been taken by Spanish forces in May of 1782, in what was, again, a part of the American Revolutionary War, the War of the American Revolution. New Providence was captured by a Spanish force under the command of Juan Manuel Cagigal. The British commander in Nassau, which is on New Providence Island, John Maxwell, decided to surrender without a fight. So basically, we've talked extensively about the capture of West Florida by the Spanish, culminating with the victory in Pensacola in May of 1781. And that opened the door to East Florida and the Caribbean for the Spanish forces. So Galvez, who has been, I think, maybe the most colorful and prominent figure in our narrative, other than maybe East Florida Governor Patrick Tonin, George Washington, of course, he did not want necessarily to invade the Bahamas. He felt like Cagigal should be focused on invading Jamaica, which would have been a much, much bigger prize than East Florida or the Bahamas. And truthfully, I have to mention at this point that Jamaica itself may have been a bigger prize than what became the United States or those 13 colonies, right, that had rebelled, because there was sugar, spices, the ability to develop rum. You could do indigo. You could grow hemp. The plantation economy in Jamaica was really vibrant throughout the 1700s, right? And the French and the Spanish both sought Jamaica, and the British had turned Jamaica into a very prosperous colony by this point, by the 1780s. So you can understand Galvez's thinking. It had been a Spanish colony until 1655. And the loss of Jamaica in 1655 at the time didn't mean a whole lot to what was at the time a thriving Spanish empire, other than this constant battle they were having with the English at the time, not the British. This was before the Act of Union of 1707. But key point here, Jamaica was probably the crown jewel. Well, obviously India was the crown jewel. In the Western Hemisphere, maybe was the crown jewel in the British Empire at the time, more so than British North America, whether you're talking about the areas that became the United States or the areas that became Canada, and certainly more so than East Florida or the Bahamas. But Cagigal pressed his luck, right? He had close to 3,000 troops that he took from Havana in April of 1782, leaving kind of Havana's defenses threadbare. They show up, and Maxwell sees this overwhelming force, and he surrenders. So this sends shockwaves through St. Augustine, because the thinking is, oh my gosh, the Spanish are definitely coming. The Spanish are on their way, and they're going to, whether they invade from the west, from Pensacola, from West Florida, or they invade from the east, from the Bahamas, they have a sandwich, right? And we have this hostile Georgia north of us. So there was a loyalist named Andrew Devereux, who is kind of an interesting character. Devereux had become a loyalist and was from South Carolina, and was loyal to the British Crown. Now, the irony being, he had initially joined the Continental Army. He had initially been a patriot, but his father was under constant badgering from locals in Beaufort, South Carolina, which, by the way, is a lovely town. You can drive through it. When you're driving from Savannah to Charleston, you drive through it on US 17. Get off US 17 and explore the town. Wonderful place. He becomes a fervent loyalist. And in fact, he becomes one of the people responsible for the burning of the Prince William Parish Church in Sheldon in April 1779. This burning is one of the inspirations for the fictional scene in the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot. The burning of the church and the killing of the local residents. Now, I think the commanding officer for the British in that particular film was based on Guy Carleton, not on Devo. But whatever way, Devo engaged in that sort of atrocity or a similar atrocity. He was present at the siege of Savannah in 1779, having joined up with Major General Augustine Prevost, who's got the same surname as our current Pope, so French origin, British officer, surname of our current Pope before he took the name Leo XIV. And Prevost, as we've talked about before, was the overall commander in St. Augustine from 1776 to 1779, often clashing with Patrick Toney, who didn't clash with Governor Patrick Toney. He was at the siege of Charleston also, and he was promoted to colonel, and he was among those leading the occupation of Charleston. But in 1782, as we know, as we've talked about, the British evacuated Charleston, and Devo and his men went to St. Augustine. At that point, he starts plotting to recapture the Bahamas. So in St. Augustine, he gathered a force of about 90 to 100 men, 6 vessels, and then they set sail for Harbor Island, Bahamas, which was still under British control. And there was only 220 men and there that they could add to their force. And total, they had maybe about 200 muskets. So they depart St. Augustine, but then they get joined by the 26-gun privateer Perseverance, which Thomas Dow was commanding, and the 16-gun 120-man brigantine commanded by Daniel Wheeler. It was called Whitby Warrior. So, in addition to the 170 volunteers that these ships gathered at Harbor Island, they could sail for New Providence. So all told, they had maybe about 300 regulars, militia, and volunteers, but they did have 7 ships. So they reached New Providence on April 10th. And what happened was that the governor of Cuba, Luis de Unzaga, sent a message to Devo and the British saying peace preliminaries had been agreed in Versailles, and that the Bahamas were to be restored to British rule in exchange for East Florida, which was not necessarily believed at the time. So Devo keeps sailing, and on April 13th, the Spanish commander at New Providence, naval commander, mistook Devo's fleet for smugglers, and there ended up being a bit of a gunfight. The commander retreated into a citadel, and they arranged a ceasefire. Devo, the next day, which was April 14th, rescinded it, and the Spanish scuttled their warships and retreated to the fort before surrendering on April 18th. So over 600 Spanish troops surrendered, 50 cannons and 7 ships were captured by the British. Some of the ships that were scuttled were later recommissioned, re-put into service, and sailed away to Cuba. So, in East Florida, it was not known, as we've talked about, until much later that the colony was being exchanged for the Bahamas. Deveau had gotten word of this on April 10th, wasn't sure what to make of it. As we talked about, the East Florida Gazette had, soon after this, most famous edition of the East Florida Gazette talked about the heroic efforts of Deveau and these British loyalists who had sailed from St. Augustine, who were by this time residents of East Florida, in liberating the Bahamas. But in fact, in September, it was confirmed, although, again, not necessarily communicated to, because of the slow communications, to those in East Florida until 6 to 8 weeks later. September of 1783 was confirmed that this trade had taken place. Even though the British had effectively captured the Bahamas, recaptured the Bahamas, it increased their leverage. And as we're going to talk about in one of the future episodes, Robert and I will talk about, giving East Florida up to the Spanish was very hard on the British loyalists that had come to East Florida, but it was not that hard on the Crown, who saw it as being better in Spanish hands and as a potential way to create intrigue and divisions between the Spanish and the Americans than it being ceded to the Americans, which they still thought was a possibility. And the American obsession with Florida, which had begun in 1775, continued right through 1819. As I think most of our listeners know, we've done a lot of podcasts and series on on Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's obsession with Florida. We've now done 4 parts on George Washington, more recently, on George Washington's obsession with linking Florida to the other colonies and making it part of the United States. So it was easier to cede it to the Spanish and assume at some point Spain and the U.S. were going to have problems, and assume at some point Spain and Britain were going to reconcile. And all of that happened. So that sets up your next phase of Florida history. We're going to talk a little more about that in the coming episodes with Robert and myself. But so what happens to Deveau? He goes back to St. Augustine, but with the evacuation of East Florida between the summer of 1784 and 1785, the evacuation of British loyalists from East Florida, he was given a large portion of Cat Island, which is part of Bahamas, where he built a mansion at Port Howe, and the ruins of that are still on display today. If you go to Cat Island, which there used to be air service to Cat Island, and then I remember Cat Island took a massive hit first from Hurricane Francis in 2004, and then more recently from Hurricane Dorian, which was a Cat 5 hurricane at the time, in 2019. Anyway, Robert and I will be back next week to talk about the final naval battle of the American Revolution.